ऐसी मशीन लगाऊंगा, इस साइड से आलू घुसेगा, उस साइड से सोना निकलेगा।
They are asking a foul question and the CPM question.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the Attention Please podcast. So this is the IPL begins this week, and I'm almost tempted to do another team-based analysis because I'm so obsessed with IPL, but I'm going to desist from doing that. Instead, I'm going to touch upon perhaps the biggest news to emerge out of Bengal in a while, which will have a huge impact, at least within the next 2 months, if not for more. And no, I'm not referring to, of course, Mamata Banerjee versus Shubhendu Babu, but Rinku Singh opting out of IPL this season, which is possibly the greatest blessing in disguise or not that Bengal has had in a long, long, long time. And with that cheap shot at Rinku Singh, let me come to this episode of the podcast. So last time, and again, we are going to still be going with politics for a while because I've been obsessed with the Bengal elections, the coverage, which since it's a blessing to have your YouTube connected to your smart TV, because I can, in the evening when I sit with my dinner, I can dive right into the bowels of Bengal politics with curated content from multiple channels. And Bengali politics is this local parashad. It's, I mean, if watching Republic English is smoking Camel cigarettes, this is like smoking biri. It has this rustic flavor, and things are, bare metal and hard knuckle. That's like politics stripped down to its essentialities. So if you feel that politics in India has become dirty and personal and vicious, well, you haven't seen Bengal politics, where interviews are, let's just put it, much less politically correct. Politics is interspersed with personal battles. Like, for instance, today I was watching an interview with the estranged wife of a TMC politician who then joined BJP with his paramour. And then she was denied a ticket by the BJP. He got a ticket. And so he again quit the party. What an honorable act of abnegation. And now he is without a party, but his wife, who was left for the other woman, she has her TMC ticket. So I just finished watching about 40 minutes of her gloating over that. So, as I said, of course, there was nothing in terms of policy or what she stands for, but that's par for the course in Bengal politics. Nobody, I mean, if you're part of Trinamool Congress, I mean, what do you really stand for except a personality cult for Mamata Banerjee? And if you're in BJP, well, we don't know what you stand for because all your members are Trinamool Congress, Trinamool Congress ex-employees. And I use the word employees with a full understanding of the ramifications of it. But today, let's talk about what I wanted to discuss in the last episode, but I kind of ran out of time because, as I said, I've been trying to wrap this up within 40 minutes. So I'm trying not to keep on talking. And if the topic goes, it needs more in-depth treatment, I'm going to try to have it spill over into the next episode rather than continue. So let's just see how this works. Anyways, so what I wanted to talk about, and we kind of touched upon this in my interview with Rahul Roshan 2 weeks ago, was about Hindutva. And we had brought that up. And for me, the definition of Hindutva, minus the pejoratives, is simply Hinduism as a political identity. So Hinduism is a religious identity, or I would say and again, that's a topic for another day, whether Hinduism is a religion in the Judeo-Christian definition of a religion. I would say it's not. It's a collection of heterogeneous traditions. But Hindutva is definitely a simplification, a more, it takes Hindus, it takes this collection or as a bouquet of traditions, packages it as a religion. And one can say that this package already exists, but what distinguishes Hindutva from quote unquote Hinduism is its use of Hinduism as a political identity. Now, I personally don't, and this is my own personal beliefs, I don't think of myself as a politically a Hindu, because for me, politics is about the individual. But that's purely my personal opinion. I do not want to be thought of as a member of any kind of group. And I think that the reason why politics is the way it is that politicians, regardless of the political spectrum, can always appeal to your group sensitivities, and by doing so, manage to get away by not serving you as an individual. So that's really the trick that has been played. And again, this is something which Plato said hundreds and thousands of years ago, that this is really the way it works. So for me, I tend to not see myself as the member of any group, whether it's my gender, whether it is my age, whether it is my religion. But that's just me. I do not, again, it's my opinion isn't germane in this case. But the thing is that if you allow other religions, if you think that it is perfectly fine for them to organize on the basis of their religion in the way that you have no problem with, let's say, an OSC, then I don't see why, in the interests of equal standards, why it's a problem if Hindus do it. Now, it's not a problem also if Hindus do it. You can have sub-identities with Hinduism as a political identity. You can have, a Dalit identity as a political identity. You just can't have an all-encompassing Hindu identity. And why is that the case? What is specifically so terrible about the Hindu identity, which is why the word Hindutva is such a dirty word? Well, usually I find that any kind of discussion on this in social media ultimately leads to what I believe is a gaslighting argument. And I love to use the word gaslighting because it's such a progressive new age word. I didn't even know what this meant till a few years ago. And the response is that only identities which are under attack as an identity are allowed or have a good reason to form a political group. If the other quote unquote dominant identity forms a political group, then that's fascism. Well, leaving aside the central premise of this intensely flawed argument, let's look at the other thing. So let's presume that this is true. How is it, and this is where the gaslighting comes in, is how is it that Hindus as a group aren't under threat? Why is that the case? This entire premise is based on a willful suppression of history. And I'm not talking about Mughal times. I mean, that's part of it. This is where Aurangzeb wasn't a bad guy because, look at all these Hindu temples he didn't destroy. So this is based on a willful, almost hilarious reinterpretation of history, and sometimes even recent history, like, for instance, the genocide of Kashmiri Pandits. It totally ignores many incidents in India, which are hidden by the media by obfuscating the names and religions in some specific cases. I'm perfectly fine with newspapers not publishing the religious affiliation of somebody in any news. I'm perfectly fine with that. Because again, I want to focus on the individual. But in many cases, that's not true. There is no uniform standards for this. So that's why, the hate tracker that, I don't know, I guess it no longer exists. They didn't record any kind of hate crimes on Hindus. It just didn't. And then that became the basis of data that was then used by international publications. Everybody referred to this one database with nary an analysis of how they decided what gets into the database and what gets out of it. This narrative that Hindus are never under attack is so many incidents where that's not true. And again, it's true for any religion. It's not true. This is not, Hindus are the only people under attack. No, that's not true. Wherever you are in a minority, you are under attack. Now, it's not a case as like people, let's say, for instance, in the US. there's so many anti-Hindu racist attacks that have happened over the last 20 years. You have a state like Alabama, where I tweeted this link. Even today, yoga is not allowed because the Christian conservatives there believe that yoga is a connection to the devil. And this is perfectly fine in the US, again, albeit in one state in the US. But some people in Indians told me, how can you extrapolate from one backward state like Alabama to the entire US, which is an absolute paragon of religious freedom. By the way, the same logic isn't used when isolated incidents in Uttar Pradesh are used to tarnish entire India. That doesn't work at that point, and that's fine then. If you can't say, Uttar Pradesh is a really backward state in India, and so you should not really extrapolate that to mean that India has become intolerant. But no, that you cannot do at that point of time. But with Alabama, yes, you can. This is where the problem is, the double standards. And as a long-time listeners of this show know, this show is focused on looking and peering in and wiping the dust of the double standards that have characterized, quote unquote, liberal discourse in this country. Now, if you want to look at what Hindus as a minority face, you just have to look at what happened in Bangladesh after Narendra Modi's visit there, where Hindus were attacked, killed, temples were attacked, which, by the way, was blamed on Modi. It was blamed on Modi. And when Sheikh Hasina, for instance, in 2017, when she visited Ajmer Sharif, Dargah, there were no attacks in India. And that's a great thing. That's the way it should be. Nobody blamed Sheikh Hasina for going to an Islamic place of worship and thus inflaming communal sentiments, as if the problem is somebody visiting, a head of state visiting a religious place of worship, as if that's the big problem. It's not the communal violence that happens after it. Because, of course, as we know, some identities are absolutely fine and some identities are not. So this is a long-winded introduction for what I had wanted to cover in the last episode, which was that a bunch of Bengali intellectuals, this happened, I think, last week, which was why I wanted to cover it last week. They came out and it was headed by, many people, out of which perhaps the only recognizable figure pan-India would be Parambrata. Again, when I say recognizable, please consider air quotes around recognizable, because he would perhaps be known as the policeman in Kahani. So he plays, like in Hindi movies, he plays usually his role is sensitive Indian male, is usually what he plays in movies. And he's fairly popular in Bengal, though I think his star is on the wane. And he is also known in Bengali movie circles as perhaps the first guy who went and took a course in a US university on acting, which then became the kind of level that everybody has to come to the US for 3 months or 6 months to do a course. And that's now become the water level for Bengali intellectualism in movie circles. But this is just an introduction to Parambrata. I was very lucky that I sat next to him and got my picture taken with a small person like me. And of course, in Bongo Shambhadan, I posted it. So he was a fairly big star. But again, as I said, his popularity as a star is kind of on the wane in Bengal, but that's not his fault. I think he's a fairly decent actor and he has screen presence, and the reason why I say is that he is perhaps one of the names you would recognize in that social media statement that came out. And there was a cringe video along with it. Oh, and there's another person called Anupam Roy. And again, many people outside Bengal won't recognize him, but he's a big deal in Bengal. He's also a graduate from Jadavpur University, I think, computer science, electrical, much younger. I think I don't know how many years junior to me, quite a few, perhaps 4 or 5 years junior. And of course, insanely popular in Bengal for his music, some of which is bad, some of which is good, I'm sorry, and some of it is essentially and for those of us who study Jadavpur University would know exactly what that means, basically a tukli of his good stuff. But again, these two were the names which were recognizable, perhaps not outside Bengal, but it's not important. What was important was, and again, what's interesting, and I would say that it was important, was that they came out with there was a cringe video along with it. and about the cringe video about, the fascism and Manuvadi fascism, I think, fascist, Nazi, Manuvadi, what BJP was essentially. That, do whatever you want, but don't vote for these fascist Nazi Manuvads, which is what BJP is. So essentially vote for Trinamool Congress, but I'm too chicken to say it because, of course, I need to keep my intellectual hat on. Also, I'm not really Trinamool either. I'm actually a CPM guy, but I'm ashamed to say it because if I say it, then you will possibly turn around to me and say, well, how do you support Stalin? So I also want to wash my hands of the rather troubling history of the Kaste Haturi Tara. So I kind of pretend to be independent and say, do whatever you want, but just don't vote for this fascist Manuvads. But if you look at the list of people who were part of it, they're all like hardcore CPM people. Okay. And some of them have, of course, played footsie with the Trinamool Congress for their own, I would say, for perhaps their own survival, because ultimately, as we all know, the paradox behind this whole fascist thing is that the quote-unquote fascism of Modi doesn't really hurt them. It's the fascism of Didi which does, because they work in the Didi market. They don't work in the Modi market because Modi has no influence in their daily lives. So there was this 5-minute propaganda video. It was terribly done. And this is what I was most disappointed at. I mean, I'm not disappointed in what they're trying to say. I mean, what else are they going to say? Because, if Didi comes back, they will have to ask for their, whatever it is that they get, that 1 lakh, 2 lakh, 5 lakh awards from the West Bengal government. So I'm not saying that what they were saying was fundamentally wrong or fundamentally not aligned with what they want. But, what a crappy propaganda video, because if there's one thing the Communist Party of India used to do very well, was they used to make good propaganda video, because propaganda is a big part of the whole communist experience. So I wanted to ask, seriously, what's wrong with these people? Yeah, I mean, they were growing up, they used to go to Nandan and watch all these Marxist movies, I presume. So what were they doing? Were they just, playing footsie with each other in Nandan and not absorbing any lesson as to how to make good propaganda videos? Anyways, so the BJP, as I said, is fascist, Nazi, and Manuvad. And, they were not pulling any punches. But what was interesting, and this is really what I want to touch upon, is that there's this subtext which is kind of intrinsically attached to the parochial politics of Trinamool Congress, where the whole thing is everybody is Bohiragato because they don't speak Bengali. So this is again an example of supreme hypocrisy, where it is terrible to be a Hindu chauvinist. That's fascist. And that's Nazi, but it's perfectly fine to be a Bengali chauvinist, because I don't know what that is. So it's perfectly fine to have being Bengali as a political identity, and pointing to people who speak Bengali with an accent. By the way, these people who claim to be Bengalis don't know much Bengali either. Many of them also speak Bengali with a terrible accent. So, they're not blameless. So just putting it, but anybody who speaks Bengali with a Marwari accent, or they're all Bohiragatos, even if they have stayed in the state and they were born there, it's not a problem. Unless, of course, it's like anybody who's joined the Trinamool Congress. At that point of time, they are insiders. So anyways, leaving that aside, there's this fundamental underlying historical falsehood that these guys like to say. And I don't think that many of them even know this because of the way history was taught to them. How do I know how history was taught to them? Because these people are kind of my age, and we learned from the same history books, which were written by CPM Marxist hacks. So I know exactly the history books they read. They're all from, my school or from the Madhyamik exam. So I know exactly what they read. And so I've read it myself. So the fact is that this Hindu Manuvadi ethos is essentially against the heterodox Bengali culture. So the cultural Kandaris of Bengal, the thing is that Hindutva is foreign to us. It is a Gujarati thing, it's a Marwari thing, it's a Bohiragato thing. And that the Hindu identity is something which is diametrically polarly opposite to the Bengali identity. So the Bengali identity is nice and inclusive, and we celebrate Durga Puja with everyone, but these Ram guys who coming from Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Rajasthan, Gujarat, who are not Bengalis. I mean, look at the way they speak Bengali. There's something wrong with these guys. So this is an ethos which is absolutely foreign to us. So we should reject this Manuvadi fascist foreign influence. This is essentially the basis of everything they say, which is absolutely aligned. And this is perhaps a more an intellectualization of the kakakiki, all of that stuff that Mamata Banerjee does. This is a more sophisticated way of putting it. Now, the fact is that no matter what you think of the BJP, I'm not going to get into whether they're fascist or not. I mean, okay, fine. If you think they are, then they are. But without getting into that, because again, I want to wrap this up within a reasonable amount of time, is that the thought that Hindutva as a political identity, as an exclusivist identity, is a outside Bengal concept. This is a gross historical inaccuracy, which is spread either through genuine ignorance because they read the wrong history books, or they did read the wrong history books, then they actually learned what the true history was, and then now they again willfully choose to suppress the actual history. I don't know. I hope, honest to God, that it's the second one, because I believe that at least one thing I can expect these people to be is to be well read. I hope that they're not basing their worldview based on their class 8 history book. I sincerely hope not. But if I have to presume that they have read and they are willfully suppressing it, then that ascribes to them a malignancy, which I also cannot support because I don't have any data to back it up. So I'll just leave it there, that I don't know whether they're genuinely ignorant or whether they themselves are choosing to hide the fact that the whole intellectual notion of Hindutva, like many, many concepts in India, came from Bengal. The term was coined by a person called Chandranath Boshi, who was a disciple of Bankim Chandra, and he wrote Hindutva, Hindur Prakrito Itihash. The basic tenet of a lot of Hindutva intellectualism in Bengal at the time of Bankim Chandra, who's the guy who wrote Ananda Math, from which Vande Mataram is taken, was that the history they had been read, and again, if this sounds familiar, it is, that the history they had been read is not the actual history of what happened. And this is something which Bankim Chandra himself said. This is a secularized history that is not actually even true, that has been taught, and we accept it to be true. So Hindutva was that political Hinduism, which now, based on this political Hindu identity, wants to re-examine what has been accepted to be history. So I'm not saying that Hindutva, as Parambrata would like to say it, which is people going in and doing communal riots, that was something which came from Bengal, maybe or maybe not. But the word Hindutva itself is as Bengali as Rasgulla. Somebody would say that perhaps Bengali Rasgulla isn't Bengali, it's from Orissa, but I'm, keep that to the side. Hindutva is very much a Bengali thing. Again, was this ever in our history books? You bet not. So Bankim Chandra's Ananda Math, if you read it, and again, these Bengalis, because they also have to play to the Bengali parochial feeling, cannot go and directly attack Bankim Chandra. They can't call him a fascist Nazi Manuvad, except that by their standards, if they actually read Ananda Math, then it would definitely be considered by their standards to be absolutely fascist Manuvadi stuff. But Prakrito Bengalis like Parambrata, who are very concerned about Bangaliana, would balk at such a description. How can that be? How can Bankim Chandra be Hindutva? And it is. And this is fact, the first edition of Ananda Math was targeted at the British. But in the second edition, and this is something which serious Marxist historians have pointed out, was that Bankim Chandra basically turned the target to Islamic rulers. So according to Marxist historians, who obviously hated this, it was because Bankim Chandra was scared of the British. We don't know why he did it, but he did it. And it is, for those of you who have read it, an extremely provocative book. An extremely provocative book. I've always found it, even when I read it, it's slightly uncomfortable for me. And I'm, as I said, personally, I am a very, I don't consider myself to be, I am a Hindu, but I don't consider myself to be a political Hindu. That's my own personal opinion. I don't consider myself political anything except, Arnab. But I found it a little, what is this? But if Paramruta wants to be honest, and intellectuals should be honest, he should say that, guess what? This quote-unquote fascist Nazi Manuvadi comes from Bengal. It's very much a part of our ethos. Now, he might not agree with it. That's fine. Say that. But don't try to superpose this Bohiragato narrative with this, because this is not true. Because Bengal politics, the thing is, it has always been very communally polarized. This whole notion of this Amra Shobai Bangali, irrespective of religion, this is absolutely a Marxist construct. I'm not saying that you don't lie. I mean, lying is sometimes good from a nation craft point of view. You want people to move away from polarized identities. I get that. I get that as a matter of real politics. So I'm not saying that some amount of subterfuge isn't bad, but the subterfuge shouldn't be that bad or that flimsy that anybody who spends about an hour reading history will find out that it is a lie. So the Bengal politics has always been extremely communally polarized. And this happened after, for those of you who've read history, the Battle of Plassey, when the armies of Clive, again a British bandit, essentially Lord Clive, bullshit, British bandit Clive, defeated Sirajuddaulah. Ultimately, the bulk of the treachery were the Hindu businessmen who resented, and the Nawab was a terrible human being. They basically said, okay, let the British come in. How bad could they be? And then when the British came in, because the nobility at that time was predominantly Islamic, who they felt they could not trust, because after all, they were imperialists, they wanted to rule the country, they created the permanent settlement, which was basically replaced the Islamic ruling underclass with an underclass of Hindu rulers. And these people had kind of tethered themselves to the British. So there was a reversal of power within a generation. Muslims fell into poverty, and Hindus eagerly clutched on to the British in terms of the language. That was when the quote unquote the Renaissance of Bengal began, because Bengali Hindus started adopting English language, English literature, English science. They started, and the Brahmo movement began, which was kind of a Catholicization of Hinduism. So it was not that they also were particularly quote unquote proud of their heritage, but they wanted to move to kind of an acceptable form of Hinduism, where acceptability is defined by what Catholic priests say. So there was a movement. Again, these things are not simple. I mean, history never is. But the fact is that the division between Hindus and Muslims in Bengal has been there for ages. And it has been communal politics, Hindutva, Hinduism as a political identity. It's not just a question that I'm saying that this was a word that was used in some book. Somebody could say, all right, you got me there. But how does it have anything to do with the ground reality? No, the ground reality itself was that Hindutva was very much a part of Bengal politics for hundreds of years. And at that point of time, one of the one of the persons who actually pointed this out was Rabindranath Tagore. He was one of the people who pointed this out, that there is a huge disparity. And I've discussed this before in my podcast, that his novel Ghore Baire is an extremely prescient view of communal politics, in which he's blaming the Congress party for communal politics, by the way. He's not blaming the fascist Nazi Manuvads for that. He's blaming the actual people who began the kind of aggressive communalization that would lead to the partition of the country. When Bengal in 1905 was divided by Lord Curzon, the predominant narrative that the Hindu intellectuals wanted to tell people, at that point of time, it was more easy to control the narrative. There was no social media. Here we're talking about 1905, was that Bengal as a whole rose up against the divisive politics of Lord Curzon, and they undid the partition of Bengal. That's not historically true, even though that was what was taught in our history books in the 90s. It wasn't true. The Muslim population actually thoroughly welcomed it, because they were sick and tired of Hindu domination in the politics of Bengal. And Rabindranath Tagore himself said that, what do you expect? What do you expect them to do? We do not treat them as equal Bengalis. We define Bengalism to be Hindu upper caste identity. And then once the British, and we are perfectly fine with mollycoddling with the British, but then when the British come back and strike down upon us, we suddenly run to these very people and we expect them to be quote unquote patriotic at that point of time. Why would they? Why would anybody do that? And if you read Ghore Baire, his main critique of Gandhi, and I said this before, but it's an extremely, extremely nuanced critique, was that when you come and the non-cooperation movement, the boycott foreign goods, whatever Muslim prosperity there was in Bengal was based on the cloth trade. It was based on, because Hindu intellectuals normally didn't go into business. They were basically landed gentry who had then branched off into glorified clerical work for the British, or were writing novels. Business was still predominantly, and the main business was export, basically importing British goods from Manchester and selling them on the streets. And what did the Congress do under Gandhi? They targeted exactly that. They targeted the commerce that was predominantly Islamic. Not only that, they organized public bonfires. And whoever did not participate was dubbed as an anti-national. And what did the Hindu upper class, rich people do? Well, they just, they sewed their own clothes, which was, as I have said before, was that era's, Instagram. So this was essentially for virtue signaling. They could sit there, they had nothing to do, their food was there on the table, so they could sit and spin. And that cloth couldn't be sold because it was not done at scale. That cloth could only be worn. It was very thick. It was not practical to wear, but it was essentially a social media event. They're spinning cloth. It didn't help the poor. Nobody could wear it. And for those of you who can't read the book, see the movie made by Satyajit Ray. There's a scene in which the person who represents the Rabindranath Tagore's view said that, in 1905, when the Bengal partition happened, we talked about Swadeshi. I didn't go out. I mean, he's not saying this. His teacher is saying this about him, that, he didn't go out and make fiery speeches condemning people's lack of patriotism or asking them to not use British goods. He went and he tried to make Indian soap. Maybe he didn't succeed, or maybe his products were also crap, but, his heart was in the right place. He wanted there to be an Indian alternative which was commercially viable before you went out and told people that you cannot trade in British goods, because the consumers of these products were poor people and the people who made money from it were Muslim traders. So this was essentially where the conflagration that led to the birth of Bangladesh. And because in India, most India's focus is, Hindi and Punjab and Haryana, the focus has always been on the western side of the partition. So very less on the eastern side of the partition, which was far more bloody, far more violent. And at least on the west, there was an equitable balance of population. So people from both sides changed. The land that was available was more or less the same. So there was not that amount of tension that there was on the eastern side, where there was very little migration from west to east. Most of the migration was from east to west. And this led to, and this was one of the reasons that ultimately led to the impoverization of Bengal, this unequal distribution of population. But the problem was that, what I'm trying to say was that communal politics and isolation of the Islamic population was not something which has started with Shobindu Adhikari or Mithun Chakravarti. This has always been there. One of the things that Bengalis are very proud of are like the Bengali revolutionaries. Onushilan Shomiti, which was one of the secret societies, was used very strong Hindu imagery. They didn't have, I can't think of, and I might be wrong, but I can't think of Muslim freedom fighters in Onushilan Shomiti because it was a very, very, very Hindu organization. And so was Jugantar, which was kind of which was kind of a sub-organization from Onushilan Shomiti. And many of Bengal's greatest quote-unquote secular heroes, Bagha Jotin and Khudiram Bose, Prafullo Chaki, they would not perhaps be very happy with the way the Anupam Roys and Parambratas are characterizing what they believed in. So many of the Bengali heroes who have metro stations named after them or who are considered to be quote-unquote secular were actually not. They were strongly subscribed to this notion of a Hindu identity, a Hindu political identity. The India which they saw was predominantly a Hindu majoritarian state. Again, I'm not passing any judgment on anybody, but I'm just saying this was the truth. And again, there are Marxist historians like Shumit Sarkar who have pointed this out. This is not something which is not known. This is fairly well known. It's just that people don't like to talk about it. Golwalkar, right? Everybody knows who he is. Guess where he learned. Guess what his inspiration was? He came to Belur Math, okay, and he studied under Swami Akhandananda. And what is Belur Math? Belur Math is Ramakrishna Thakur. His picture is there on every Bengali wall. So he studied, his notion of Hinduism came from Belur Math under Swami Akhandananda, who was a disciple of Ramakrishna Thakur. So the very intellectual foundation of RSS can be traced to something which is essentially very, very Bengali. Now, RSS shakhas have existed outside Kolkata for a long time. Again, Bengali intellectuals who are very Kolkata-centric are blissfully unaware of this. I've heard many of my quote-unquote secular liberal friends say on WhatsApp, there was never an RSS in Bengal before. Oh yeah, there was never an RSS in Kolkata before, but Kolkata isn't Bengal. As a matter of fact, in a past life, when our current chief minister, Mamata Banerjee's chief enemy was the communists, she attended RSS events. Guess what? And what did she say? Well, let me quote. This is from Times of India. In between, she, Mamata Banerjee, went through what appeared to be a saffron initiation by attending an RSS function held to mark the release of a book listing the crimes of communists in India and Nepal, taking in one fell swoop everything from CPM to the outlawed extreme left. The book is written by Panchajanna editor Tarun Vijay. Okay, so this is the event that Mamata Banerjee is attending. Though top RSS functionaries Mohan Bhagwat, Madan Das Devi and RSS elder H.V. Shishadri, as well as Defense Minister George Fernandez were present, Mamata was clearly the star speaker. BJP MP Balbir Punj introduced her as Hamari Pyari Mamata ji, jo Sakshat Durga Ma hai. And she responded equally eloquently when it was her turn to speak. This is the first occasion that I have had to meet top RSS leaders, she said in Hindi. But I realized immediately that these are the real Desh Premis, patriots. She added that she was pleased to see that RSS shared her concerns about the left, a political grouping she had spent her entire political career battling against. Denouncing the communists as fascists and hypocrites with double standards, she said that the Trinamool Congress's natural ally was the BJP. And I will post the link for those of you who want to read this. This just goes to show that for the Parambrotos of the world, whatever they're saying is nonsense. It's based on, as I said, a willful suppression of past and recent history. The fact that the people they support, or is the point that Mamata Banerjee did not know what the RSS were? And as long as the RSS was helping Mamata Banerjee, this is basically the same relationship that she had with Maoists. As long as the Maoists were helping her in Nondigram, Maoists did not exist in Bengal. It was a communist chakranto. The moment she became the chief minister, everybody became a Maoist. Everybody became a Maoist. I'm sorry, you are Maoist. So these Maoists, in a space of a few months, from no one to they suddenly just basically took over the whole state. So this whole notion of fascist outsiders, all of this is nothing but political posturing. These were her best friends a few years ago. And she had absolutely no problem with the Bohiragotos like Mohan Bhagwat, Madandas Devi, Tarun Vijay. These were not that, there's no problem with that. And then they were then as Bengali as Rashogolla again. So again, when Bengali intellectuals lampoon people, like they lampoon their own people from like becoming BJP and traitors to their communist Trinamool cause, they conveniently forget the record of the person who supports them, this in their, middling artistic exploits. And I'm talking about Mamata Banerjee. There is an interesting video that I found out about one of the new joinees to the Trinamool Congress party, who is now saying, what a great and glorious leader Mamata Banerjee is. They have the speech of hers, contrasting with a speech that she gave 2 or 3 years ago when a movie was banned in Bengal, effectively taken out of the theaters because they felt that it was lampooning Mamata Banerjee. Again, no fascism there at that point of time, but she was a few very, very CPM actors, including the great Soumitra Chatterjee, who were there, who were criticizing Mamata Banerjee. They were brave enough to say that then. And she was then saying that, many of my fraternity are afraid of saying what the truth is. Maybe they're very happy with the 1 lakh that they receive from the state government. Well, this person 2 years later, I guess, is taken that 1 lakh. I don't know what it is, but it just goes to show, how hollow their intellectualism and how hollow their stance against fascibadi is. They're absolutely fine mollycoddling with all kinds of fascists as long as it serves their interests. Now, again, none of these intellectuals have talked about the fact that we had the Bardhaman bomb blasts on October 2nd on all dates at Khagragor a few years ago. Mamata Banerjee blamed the RAW for that. Bengal had become or still has become a hotbed of dissidents, terrorist dissidents in Bangladesh. So what we blame Pakistan, the same thing Bangladesh can blame us for doing at this point of time. This was not a problem with any Bengali intellectual, by the way. And there was no problem that Mamata Banerjee was blaming India for manufacturing that. Again, if Trump does this, it's a problem. If Trump supports Russia over his own FBI, then these same Bengali intellectuals will share that as a status. But they have absolutely no problem, maybe because of that, the nice grants they get, when Mamata Banerjee does the exact same thing. Now, which brings me to the fact is that then why has BJP never been a force here if Hindutva politics is as quote unquote Bengali as a Rashogolla? Well, it's principally because of what I have said for many years. BJP has never had a Bengali face. It hasn't, and it's not just a question of a Bengali face. It's that the BJP's whole marketing has been targeted towards the UP Bihar base, in the sense its definition of what the Hindu identity is broadly predicated on the UP Bihar version of Hinduism. Again, since Hinduism is inherently not a religion with the same kind of simple yes and no's that other the Judeo-Christianic or Abrahamic religions have, it is a collection of traditions. There are multiple flavors of Hinduism. And rather than focus on what is common to all of them, the BJP has frequently taken an extremely myopic UP Bihar based, and I don't think that the myopia is deliberate. It is because their main political, their entire political cadre, their leadership cadre is picked from those two states and Gujarat. So what do you expect is going to happen? Their definition of Hinduism is basically based on their own lived definition of Hinduism, and one of the biggest things is their insistence on vegetarianism, cow worship, things which are not driving forces of the Bengali version of Hinduism as a political identity. These are not some of, let's say, the iconic symbols of what even a Hindutva sympathetic Bengali would think. As a matter of fact, the very fact that the BJP leads with this aggressive vegetarianism is off-putting for many Bengalis, who would then say, well, you know what, they're going to come and snatch away our fish. That has been BJP's biggest problem. And if you think I'm trivializing things, does it all come down to fish? No, I'm not. This is exactly the way most Bengalis think. And this is where the Porambrotos and the Mamata Banerjees can then drive their truck and say, look, Porambroto won't do this. But Mamata Banerjee does. That's where she sometimes plays the soft Hindutva card. She says, I am as Hindu as anybody. Do you know what my Gotra is? And she says, my Gotra is, I don't have any Gotra. I'm a Hindu Muslim. Oh, by the way, it's Shandila, by the way. So the whole thing is that this is where the parochialism is driven. This is the intellectual gap that Mamata Banerjee can ram through. She says, you're proud to be a Hindu? No, I don't think you're proud to be a Hindu. I don't think really that you believe in Hindutva. You want to know what Hindutva is? Hindutva is not eating fish. Hindutva is doing, celebrating Holi a day after. Hindutva is celebrating Kali Puja a day after and calling it Diwali. You really want to be that? Be Bengali. Be proudly Bengali. And this is Bengali. It's not that Bengali identity is inimical to Hinduism. Look at me. I'm a Banerjee. My Gotra is Shandil. Look at me. I mean, do I look like that, a person who, no, I'm not. So this is what you really believe in. This is what Bengalism is. And now let me be fascist. So in terms of the severest critiques of Modi's and Yogi's brand of politics, which is fascism, authoritarianism, cult-like personality, suppression of dissent, Mamata Banerjee is absolutely no different. In many cases, she's worse. But she's able to distinguish herself based on this very narrow definition of what Hindutva has been as propagated by the BJP. And this is where BJP has to work on. Now, you can say, well, what has the BJP done differently? Well, right now, what BJP has done differently isn't that it has kind of changed its appeal. It's changed its intellectual underpinning. It can't, because it's, as I said, its think tank comes from those states. But what BJP has done is basically it's outspent Trinamool Congress in a way that's just unbelievable. They've really thrown the kitchen sink, to use an old Ravi Shastriism. And they have essentially bought no other way of putting it, bought the most, the portions of the party, minus Mamata Banerjee and her nephew, who have the biggest ground appeal. So they have focused it on purely winning seats over pure winning arithmetic. And again, my thing is, it might work in this election. I still don't think that the BJP is going to win, as I said in my last podcast. But Mamata Banerjee might not get a majority by herself. She might have to ally with. So it was definitely going to be way closer than any election in Bengal has been. I think that's a fairly widely held consensus. I might be wrong. But the thing is that how is this strategy sustainable? Let's say if BJP wins, how is BJP going to sustain this without making an ideological pivot? Because ultimately, you see, people, as I've said before, they don't vote. Regrettably, they don't vote on data or what people have done. They vote on emotion, which is why Mamata Banerjee and all this, much of Trinamool Congress's electioneering, as well as BJP's, is based on emotion. And so how will the Bengali BJP's notion of Hindutva evolve? It's not that the Hindutva notion does not exist in Bengal, as I've said before. Its birthplace is Bengal, but it's a different kind of Hindutva, because what a Bengali thinks as being Hindu is fundamentally different from what a guy from Uttar Pradesh or Bihar or Gujarat or Rajasthan thinks of as being Hindu. It's not any less trenchant. It's not any less passionate. It's just that the contours, the definition, the boundaries vary. And so how will the Bengali Hindutva align with the majoritarian BJP Hindutva is something that I want to see in the next few years as a dispassionate political observer away from all of this. Because as I said, I see myself as an army of one, and I want my politician to treat me as an individual and not to treat me as a group. Because once you treat anybody as a group, you can basically convince them, I've done a lot for you. Well, not for you, but for your group. Because nobody can ever see tangible things as what somebody does for a group. I can only think tangible what you have done for me. And that, for me, I believe, is the only way that one should interact with democratic politics. But I'm also well aware that that is not the way that people interact with democratic politics. Ultimately, they're guided by, the word that Plato liked to use, which is thumos, or glory. And that glory comes from appreciation as either an individual, which again, a politician can't give you, but the easiest thing is appreciation as a group. So my identity is now considered to be dominant. If a politician can show you that, they have your vote. With that, I come to the end of this week's podcast. So once again, if you liked this podcast, if you like this podcast in general, please consider supporting it by becoming a monthly subscriber at Patreon. So the link will be provided. Again, it's voluntary. Contributions start from $1 a month. I would greatly appreciate you becoming patron. If you listen to this regularly, once again, all content will be available for everyone. So paying or not paying does not matter in terms to access. There is no paywall here at the Attention Please podcast. So till next time, bye-bye and have a nice weekend.